Hi. The original KeyStep 37 is probably my most used MIDI controller, and now the new Mark II is here. In this video, I'll go over its many new features compared to the original KeyStep 37 and to the recently announced KeyStep 32 Mark II. In a nutshell, as you can see control-wise, the KeyStep 37 Mark II is very similar to the KeyStep Mark II, or 32 Mark II as I'll call it here, except for this section here with the 4 additional macro knobs and 2 buttons. And indeed, it generally works the same way, except for new features unlocked by the new encoders, especially in control mode, far beyond simple MIDI CC controls. Then compared to the original KeyStep 37, the Mark II has all the innovations KeyStep Mark II introduced, including the ability to generate new arpeggiator and sequencer patterns using the Mutate function, or the Spice feature, and then if throughout the mutation or spicification you encountered an interesting new sequence, you could turn that into an ARP pattern, into a user ARP pattern, and the other way around. If you generated an interesting mutation, you could convert that into a sequence. The KeyStep 37 Mark II also improves on the generative mutation features of the KeyStep 32 with control over new parameters using its encoders. This applies to mutations both on the arpeggiator and the sequencer, so you can vary how these impact the pattern. For example, if you wanted more polyphony. And the sequencer has yet another new randomization feature, not available at least as of this firmware on the KeyStep Mark II. Another big new feature compared to the original KeyStep 37 is the small but very useful screen, compared to only a 3-digit display on the original KeyStep 37, unlocking plenty of new features and also allowing you to change all of the internal features using the built-in menu system, as opposed to requiring that you hook up to a computer with Arturia's MIDI control software. Before I dive into the details and look at pros and cons, a quick disclosure: Arturia sent me these controllers. Other than that, no money changed hands. They have no say over the content of this video and don't get to see it before it's published. Okay, let's dive in. The difference you'll first notice between the KeyStep 37 Mark II and the KeyStep 32 Mark II, besides the 5 additional keys, are these 4 new endless encoders. Looking closer, you'll also notice these per key LEDs, which you don't get on the KeyStep Mark II, and you did on the original KeyStep 37. Under the hood though, the KeyStep 37 Mark II has quite a few more features that are enabled by these encoders, and even though they have the same I/O, more CV modulation features coming out the mod ports. More on that later. Let's go over these one by one. First, the 4 encoders. These are endless encoders as opposed to the pot knobs on the original KeyStep 37, which have a distinct start and end, which is an upgrade, I think, since these control many banks of CC parameters, so their position quickly becomes irrelevant as you swap banks or as you control different parameters. Like on the original KeyStep 37, these encoders can be in one of 2 main modes, either MIDI CC mode or control mode, except that in control mode on the original KeyStep 37, they only controlled chord parameters, whereas here in control mode, they're contextual based on what you're up to at the time, controlling the sequencer, the arpeggiator parameters, the chord parameters, and so on. In MIDI CC mode, the situation is pretty much similar to the original KeyStep 37. You've got 4 banks of 4 parameters at a time, banks A through D. And you can configure which CCs these knobs are mapped to with a long press on the MIDI CC button and going into the respective menu. You can also do that here, by the way, with Shift and a 2-second press on the CC bank button. That's pretty much it as far as MIDI CC functionality. There's no auto mapping to parameters on DAWs. You can't give these parameters legible names, by the way, so it's always just the CC number and its value. These only send out MIDI CCs from 0 to 127, so there's no support for high-res parameters or any other type of MIDI message that you might see on other controllers. Let's take a deeper look at what these knobs do in control mode, and again, this varies contextually based on what you're up to. When they don't do anything, by the way, this will be off. So in sequence mode, you've got control over time divisions and ratchets, as well as randomization. This randomization is a new feature different from the Mutate and Spice feature. It's more aggressive in the sense that it doesn't just transpose notes an octave up or down, but also adds completely new notes. And it's also non-destructive, meaning it doesn't make any permanent changes to the pattern. Like Spice, you can always dial it down. Just to be clear, you can also undo Mutate with Shift and Reset, but Mutate is a semi-permanent change that you can also transfer to a sequence. So that's new functionality added to the sequencer. In arpeggiator mode, I think they pretty much replicate functions you could previously access, like the different types, time division, octaves, and overall length of the ARP pattern, meaning when it resets. And you can also turn off reset if you just turn this all the way counterclockwise. So nice, but no new features compared to what you could access using the menu or Shift and one of the panel keys. Continuing our exploration of what the encoders do, in Chord mode, they also give you access to parameters you could have previously accessed on the KeyStep 32 Mark II. Just quicker access, similar to the original KeyStep 37. Including voicings, with bass options. Don't forget there are additional parameters you don't get access to with the encoders if you long press the chord button. For example, you could change the strum direction or type. And also tempo sync it. Moving on, the knobs get a few KeyStep 37 Mark II exclusive features in the sequencer. Remember, when you're playing back sequences, then you've got ratchets and time division and so on. However, if, let's say, clear this sequence and we go into step record mode, then in this case, these encoders get new functionality. And let's get out of chord mode. So when you hold a note or a chord, you can shift it and you'll see the LEDs here. And change its velocity, change its length, and also shift its micro timing. Now, I did encounter some bugs here in the firmware I was testing, but hopefully they get fixed by the time you get this. So those are unique encoder features in step recording mode. Then in certain menus, they'll let you control a bunch of parameters at a time. So for example, in the CV mod menu, when you activate the mod LFO, which we'll talk about, you can control the LFO shape and rate, and whether it's synced or not. Same goes for the envelope modes. And then one of the more interesting things that these can do when you activate Mutate, so let's say go for a simple ARP pattern, so we can hear what's going on. And let's change this to just 1 octave and a slower time division. So let's work with this 7-step pattern. On the KeyStep 32 Mark II, the extent of mutation would change based on how long you press the button, and you didn't have any control beyond that. On the KeyStep 37 Mark II, this now changes. Once you activate Mutate, then you'll get a mutation, but you can now control 4 separate parameters, like I showed you earlier. So for example, the note density and polyphony. Probability is the chance that a note's pitch will change, and randomness is how far it'll go when it does. This works, of course, on sequencer mutations as well, so we now have more granular control over Mutate. To me, Mutate is really the core of what makes the new KeySteps special, along with the ability to send mutated ARPs to the sequencer and use sequences as the source for user ARPs. So to have granular control over this is a welcome feature. Moving on, also new for the KeyStep 37 Mark II compared to the KeyStep 32 Mark II are the new key LEDs. These are very useful because unlike in this video, the actual KeyStep doesn't shoot laser notes into space. With Shift, you can see which sequence bank and pattern you're on, and if you swap banks, then it'll change color until you choose a pattern. Same goes for the arpeggiator. It'll show you which pattern you're on and what the octave situation is. Same goes for scales if you picked one of these. And as you saw in step record mode, how you're shifting notes up and down. These little arrows will light up if the notes played are outside the keyboard range. Moving on, let's take a quick look at I/O. As far as the Mark II goes, the connectivity is identical. There's an on-off switch, they're powered by USB-C, they've got MIDI in and out, analog sync in and out, a jack labeled sustain, but which can be configured, self-promotion alert, to also accept continuous expression control if you want to add a fader to this, and then 4 CV outputs, pitch and gate for notes, and 2 configurable mod outputs compared to only 1 configurable output on the original KeyStep 37. And the mod outputs on the Mark II KeySteps are more capable than the original KeyStep 37, and the mod outputs on the KeyStep 37 Mark II is even more capable than the one on the KeyStep 32 Mark II, because in addition to velocity and aftertouch and the mod strip, a random value each key press and pulse on the 37 Mark II and not on the 32 Mark II, you can also configure the CV mod outputs to behave as an LFO, as an envelope, or as a cycling envelope. So if we turn this on and hook it up to one of the mod outputs, you can see we've got our LFO running here, and let's reduce its rate and change its shape. So that's pretty much it for the LFO. And then if we were to go into the envelope mode, so this gets triggered when I hit a key, and we've got attack and sustain and release control, which controls decay as well. And then the cycling envelope is a looping envelope. Let's reduce hold and just check out its attack or rise and fall. So we can shorten these to get a faster LFO or change the LFO's contour. And if we add a hold stage, we'll see that too. And let's check if I lift my finger. Yeah, it still keeps going. So it's actually not a cycling envelope. It's an LFO with configurable attack, release, and a hold stage. In terms of build, the KeyStep 37 Mark II, like the 32 Mark II, has an all-plastic body. It's much lighter than the original first-generation KeyStep 37, which has a metal base, so the original heavier KeyStep 37 is definitely more usable in self-defense situations. The keys are mini keys with velocity sensitivity and monophonic aftertouch. And you can modify the curves of both to taste. Okay, so that's what there is to know about the differences between the 3 keyboards. If you saw my review of the KeyStep 32 Mark II, you're already familiar with most of what the ARP and sequencer can do. If you didn't, I'll just speed run through these. The arpeggiator types have 3 sections: the usual suspect modes. So that's up and down, up, down, random, order, and polyphonic mode. All of these, by the way, are subject both to the length parameter, well, not the chord one, but say this one, for example, like I mentioned earlier, right? If you set the length to 7, then you'll get a different pattern. Then there are 9 longer patterns where the print on the panel gives you an idea of how they sound, whether all the notes are the same length or some are longer than the others, and whether polyphony is involved. Now these, beside being mutatable, also themselves change or regenerate every time you power cycle the controller. So this is pattern 7 for this power cycle. But if I turn it off and on, and if anyone wants to know reboot times, this is it. Go to ARP and 7. Then we now got a new pattern, which doesn't even play all the notes. It will, by the way, if I mutate it. But regardless, for this power cycle, if I go to a different pattern and back to this, it'll always be the same. Now these are, of course, mutatable. So now I'm getting all 4 notes that I'm holding in this pattern. And like I mentioned, there are different variations, with or without rests. All of these regenerated every power cycle. And with longer notes, and with polyphony. All mutatable. So Arps 7 through 15 are kind of like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get. Especially if you mutate them. And then my favorite ARP slot of all, the user ARP slot. This works based on whatever sequence you had running prior to entering this mode. So if we take this factory sequence, for example, which we can transpose, if I were to go into the user ARP, then it builds on that pattern, but only using the notes I play. Which, like I mentioned, I think is a super powerful feature. This applies to polyphonic patterns as well, and to patterns with rests. So say if I choose, I think this one, go to ARP, user ARP mode, then it will copy that pattern to the best of its ability, of course, based on the notes that I feed it. This works with Mutate 2. And if I like this pattern, I could always send it to the sequencer, and it has now become a sequence that I can transpose, or just save as a sequence somewhere in an empty slot and edit just like it was any other sequence. So speaking of sequences, again, I covered this in detail in my KeyStep 32 Mark II video, but just to speed run through this, you've got 4 banks of 16 patterns. So that's 64 patterns stored on board in total. You can offload those patterns using the MIDI Control Center software. If we clear the scale and clear the pattern, you can either step record into a pattern, you can add ties or rests, as is explained on screen. You can also play legato by pressing hold. Patterns can be up to 64 steps long, and you can set the pattern length either like this or by holding this button and pressing the number keys. So I could add 8 steps and another 8 and another 10. Besides step sequencing, you can also play into a pattern live, whether replace existing notes in it or overdub notes You could then, of course, go back and step edit this mess. Recording can be either quantized or non-quantized, and there are 2 degrees of quantization, 50% and 100%. You can also record automation of, say, the pitch or mod wheels if you wanted, and luckily that automation can also be cleared. You can also record automation of gate length spice or aftertouch, but not automation of the MIDI CCs, at least not in the current firmware. And then there are a whole bunch of self-explanatory features here, including undo, which will undo 1 layer of live recording, or if you're step recording, undo a few steps. And then one more interesting feature, let's maybe clear this and record a simpler pattern. And let's just make that 4 steps. So when playing back a pattern, I could either transpose it or play on top of it on a separate channel if I wanted. A nice and useful feature. Then once you've programmed your sequence, there are a few ways to transition between sequences, either instant, 1 bar, or at the end. And if you don't want to bother with swapping patterns manually, you can also chain patterns. Just select the bank and the patterns you want in the chain, hit play, and it'll play them in succession. Then just to cover all bases, let's talk about spice and rolling the dice. I'll choose a simple pattern, so these features are accessed with Shift. There's control of gate length, by the way, which has nothing to do with spice, but we've got that here. Anyway, spice will increasingly spice up the pattern. And if you triple tap this, it's equivalent to rolling the dice. And you can see the spicification changes. Now spice is non-destructive, so you can bring it in and out as you like. This works on sequences too. Adds ratchets. It sometimes adds transposes too, I think. It's not doing it now. But yeah, I guess it's a milder form of mutate, and it's non-destructive. Then, like other KeySteps, KeyStep 37 Mark II also supports scales. You've got shortcuts to a few here, and you can use this either as an assistive feature, so just something that won't let you play notes outside the scale. It'll double notes that are not in the scale. Or you can view this as a generative feature within the context of, say, the sequencer. So for example, if I were to go into a no scale situation and again choose factory 1, pattern 1, which we're familiar with by now. So if I was to transpose this, one semitone, it would just shift down or up. But if I were to do that in a scale, we get a totally different experience. So scales are also a really useful generative function. By the way, I don't know if you see this on camera, but this is lit differently. We're not in chord mode, rather, this is an indication that we're in a scale as opposed to not being in a scale. So this is chord mode, and this is being in a scale. And scale options aren't just what's written here. With shift scale, we get a bunch more options, including a user scale, which we can reach over here or go into the pattern scale and select user. Anyway, we can define a custom scale here. So by default, all the keys are on, but if we wanted to exclude certain keys from the scale, we would do that here. Moving on, I wanted to make an observation about chord mode. If we look at it as a MIDI effect where you press one key and a chord gets played subject to the scale, then in the original KeyStep 37, the chord sat after the sequencer, so every note in a sequence could trigger a chord and could play it strummed. In KeyStep 37 Mark II, it's the other way around. This means that you can no longer trigger chords or strums with a single sequencer note. You can, however, sequence chords into a pattern if you want. Now, an interesting side effect of this change is that you can now use strum to transpose a pattern as it plays back. This can be either confusing if you happen to forget you were in chord mode, or a really interesting generative effect if you use it intentionally. So let me explain. You can program your own chords. So, for example, I'm going to program this as a chord. And for now, let's not strum it and get out of chord mode. I'll go into the sequence, clear it out. Let's just set it to a simple 4 steps and record. So this is our sequence. Fairly straightforward. As we mentioned earlier, we can transpose sequences. Now, if I go into chord mode, something odd may happen. If I increase chord strum to an extreme, then strum will transpose the pattern. This can yield interesting results as we pass all these notes through a scale, let's say through a blues scale, or maybe increase the chord spread. So basically now strum is transposing the sequence. And maybe play around with the sequencer timing or randomization. Just an interesting trick you might want to explore. Before we head out to the pros and cons, a word about Arturia's MIDI control center. We can edit several bank and device parameters here. These are all available on the device itself, so you don't need to bother with the software unless you want to back up patterns. Okay, let's talk about some pros and cons. First, compared to the original KeyStep 37 and the KeyStep Mark II, I think it's a no-brainer. If it's within your budget, this is the better choice. Now, I've seen some reviews of the KeyStep Mark II where people miss the knobs on the left for selecting patterns on the original KeyStep or KeyStep 37, or think that the new KeyStep is too complex, so you should be aware of that. Personally, I don't miss these at all. And sure, these are a bit more complex if you want to explore the new generative features. Not much more than just pressing the mutate button or shift and spice, but there's a huge upside to diving in. Then compared to other controllers in general, on the pros side, this is the most fun I've had with a sequencer and arpeggiator on a MIDI controller. Both are top-notch and a great environment for getting creative, coming up with ideas, and for performance. I've seen more complex sequencers, but the way you can send arps and patterns to the sequencer and back, along with how you can mutate and spice things up, as well as the new random feature on the sequencer, I think this back and forth workflow is truly unique. I've not seen anything like it. The mini keys, by the way, on all of these are excellent, I think, and they've got mono aftertouch, something competitors don't offer. So those are the pros. On the cons side, while the form factor is an advantage in that you're pretty much as close as possible to the synth or computer you're using with it, the keysteps don't have a proper DAW integration like some competing keyboards, both by Arturia and other companies. So if the main thing you want to do with these is parameter control over DAW parameters, there are better options. Also, these are designed primarily to control one synth at a time, maybe two if you count playing back over a sequence while it's running. There are better options if you're looking for a multi-track sequencer. Then the pitch and mod strips are strips and not wheels. It's pretty easy to hit them accidentally with an errant pinky. Then on the wishlist side, it's great that you can sequence and automate some of the controls here, like the pitch and mod strips or spice and gate, but at least as of the current firmware, you can't automate these 16 cc's, which would have been very nice. It would also be great to be able to name these, so not see CC 74 or 71, but rather see cutoff or resonance, even if it means using the software to do that. Then beside that, I encountered a few bugs here and there, but Arturia is pretty good at fixing these. So to sum it up, like I mentioned when I reviewed the KeyStep 32 Mark II, all these cons aside, I can tell you that whenever I'll look to be inspired with new ideas, the KeyStep 37 Mark II will be my go-to keyboard. It's the one to beat for that. So that's it for this lot. If you liked the insights in this video, there are plenty more in my ever-expanding book of electronic music ideas, tips, and tricks available to the people who support this channel on Patreon. Hit like if this was useful, ring the YouTube bell below if you want to make sure you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.